I used to be really torn by Christianity. I saw it as something of a Jekyll and Hyde. On the one hand, I was enthralled by the positive message of Jesus, the idea of a life based on giving instead of taking, the message of forgiveness to all who have fallen, the message of unconditional love for all people at all times. That's how I've tried to live my life, and it's been wonderful. But I also used to see some very dark, negative aspects of Christianity too. A tendency for some Christians to be very judgmental, arrogant and religious, just like the corrupt Jewish leaders in Jesus' day. At first I dismissed them as people who misunderstood the gospel and failed to follow it properly, but the Bible always seemed to come down on their side during discussions. There's a lot of nasty stuff in the epistles of Paul, you see. The epistles of Paul are a group of 13 books in the New Testament. They contain passages which are racist, homophobic and misogynistic. They also contain a lot of very nasty, negative preaching. I used to love Jesus, but I hated Paul, and in the end I left Christianity. About a year ago now, I discovered something that turned my life around and brought me back to Christianity, though a very different form of Christianity. You see, back in the first few centuries after Christ, there were two very different versions of the epistles of Paul. There was a long version, which was read by Catholic Christians, and there was a short version, which was read by a group called the Marcionites. You can find the long version in an ordinary Bible. It's much harder to get hold of a copy of the short version. The short version was much, much shorter, about 2/3 the length of the long version. And guess what? Those nasty passages I mentioned earlier, those are the bits that can only be found in the long version. So here's a fun question. Why were the two versions such drastically different lengths? Is it because the Marcionites cut out the bits they didn't like? Or is it because the Catholics added some extra material to prop up their agenda? Both then and now the Church has said that the long version is the original. Are we going to just take their word for it? Or is there a way we can find out for ourselves? If we compare the two versions side by side, it should be fairly obvious which is the original. If you cut 30% out of an essay, you're going to leave some pretty serious holes. The flow of ideas from one logical point to the next would be completely disrupted. The conclusions at the end wouldn't make any sense because they would be referring back to missing sections, and the structure of the document would be a complete mess. On the other hand, if someone added large chunks to a document, that would also be obvious. There would be large bits that flew off on a tangent and weren't really part of the main themes of the document. They wouldn't fit in with the text as a whole. They probably wouldn't even fit in with the writing style of the author. I think it's time to look at a passage from each version of the epistles of Paul side by side, and you'll see what I mean. Here is a passage from the short version of Romans, and this is my translation of it. Now grab your Bibles and compare this with Romans 1:16 to 2:5. You may notice that the long version contains an entire half a chapter, jammed in here between the last two lines. The extra passages waffle on about how evil pagans are and how unnatural homosexuality is. But look at the version on the screen. Is there anything missing from that text? I mean, it flows perfectly. The meaning is crystal clear. The extra text in the long version is just a distraction, drawing people away from the central point that Paul is getting at. Now look at the writing style. The difference in style is so obvious that you can see it even in an English translation. I've translated this in a very precise, literal, word-for-word manner, by the way. Paul's writing was fast, simple, elegant, and often dramatic. The editor was the opposite. Slow, clumsy, confusing, tediously arguing points that aren't even relevant. Paul preached a positive message of God's love and forgiveness. The editor, on the other hand, who we find in the long version, was absolutely seething with hate. Now, this is the funny part. You see, the reason the editor added the extra text is because he misunderstood the original passage. Notice the word suppress in the 8th line. The Greek word here is katechonton, and it has more than one meaning. Its most literal meaning is possess, but it was also used to mean hold down or suppressed. The editor didn't understand these extra meanings. He thought that Paul was saying that the unrighteous possessed the truth. This confused him, and he thought that it would confuse his congregation too, so he added an extra passage to explain to his congregation how the unrighteous could be said to possess the truth. Listen to what the editor put, starting in Romans 1:19. For what can be known about God is plain to them, because God has shown it to them. For his invisible attributes, namely his eternal power and divine nature, have been clearly perceived ever since the creation of the world in the things that have been made. Do you see what I mean? The editor is explaining how the unrighteous possess the truth, and it's completely irrelevant because the word in verse 18 wasn't even being used to mean possess. The editor then goes on this major rant, completely unrelated to the original themes of Romans. This goes on for about half a chapter. In Romans 2 verse 2, the rant finally comes to an end, and we return to the theme of Romans, though the editor had to alter this verse to make it fit in with the text he'd added. He added some material to the following verses as well, but let's not worry about that now. So then, which version of this passage is the original? Well, maybe Paul wanted to make it look like someone had added extra passages. Maybe he wrote it that way deliberately, and then maybe the Marcionites noticed this and removed the extra text to make their version look like the original. No, I don't think so. That extra stuff about pagans being evil and homosexuals being perverse is a forgery. Get over it. Over the next few years and months, I'm going to make videos about the short version of the epistles of Paul. At the moment, it is impossible to get hold of a decent copy. I'll explain why that is in my next video. I'm in the process of translating a decent copy myself, and when I've finished, I plan to publish it. I'll show you previews in my future videos. Please stay tuned for my next video. I'm going to tell you more about the Marcionites and their version of the epistles of Paul. I'll also give you some good links and references to show you what secular scholars are saying on this subject. Thank you very much for watching. I hope you found this interesting. Goodbye.